This serial killer met his match right in the courtroom, and this other serial killer, the victim's father, wasn't ready to watch him go to jail without having a hand in his execution. Killers are considered to be incarnates of the devil, as their crimes leave painful memories in the minds of their victims' families forever. Sometimes, these families take matters into their own hands, executing the killers even before the court can. And some of these executions are so extreme that they leave people talking. In this video, we've compiled a list of such executions that have shocked the world. First on the list is Klaus Grabowski. Klaus Grabowski was a German convicted child molester and murderer who notoriously became popular in Germany for his crime. Born in 1937, Grabowski was a repeat offender with a history of sexual crimes, having been convicted multiple times for molesting young girls. On May 5, 1980, at the age of 7, Anna Bachmeier was abducted by Klaus Grabowski, a 35-year-old butcher whom she had previously visited to play with his cats. He kept Anna captive at his home for several hours, sexually assaulted her before finally strangling her with a pair of his fiancée's tights. He then tied her up and put her in a box, which he left on the shore of a canal. What made this case even more disturbing was that Grabowski had already been chemically castrated as part of his parole conditions after a previous conviction for sexual offenses. You'd think that would have curbed his impulses, but it didn't stop him from committing this horrific crime. If that wasn't enough to shock everyone, there was also the fact that Grabowski was actually under police surveillance at the time due to his criminal history, yet somehow he still managed to carry out such a brutal act. He tried to keep it all under wraps, but eventually he confided in his fiancée, who then reported him to the police. At his trial, Anna's mother, Marianne Bachmeier, decided to take the law into her own hands. She smuggled a gun into the courtroom, and in a moment that shook the world, she stood up, aimed the weapon at Grabowski, and shot him dead, firing 7 rounds. This act of revenge made headlines around the world, sparking debates about taking justice into your own hands, the pain of losing a child, and the legal consequences of such actions. Marianne Bachmeier's choice to shoot her daughter's murderer was an emotional and controversial case that really connected with people. She was found guilty of manslaughter and having a gun illegally, sentenced to 6 years, but was released on parole after 3. After her release, Bachmeier moved abroad. However, she returned to Germany following a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. She passed away at the age of 46 and was buried next to her 7-year-old daughter Anna in Burgtor Cemetery, Lübeck. If you think Marianne is the only parent bold enough to punish her child's killer, then this next case might change your mind. Jeff Doucet. Jeff Doucet was a child molester and kidnapper whose case gained significant attention due to the dramatic circumstances surrounding his death. He had started abusing children since he was in his 20s. He was a karate instructor in Louisiana who had the full trust of all the parents. However, he later singled out one child whom he then kidnapped and abused. Jody Peluche was just 10 years old when Doucet started testing the boundaries with him. On February 19, 1984, Jeff Doucet brought his abuse of Jody to a new level. After telling Jody's mother June that they were just going for a short drive, he kidnapped the then 11-year-old boy and took him to California. There, Doucet dyed the boy's hair black, passed him off as his son, and molested and raped him in a motel room. Jody was eventually rescued and brought back to his family in Louisiana, but the damage had already been done. Jeff Doucet was then arrested and was set to face justice in the courtroom for his crimes. However, on March 16, 1984, he encountered a different form of justice at the hands of Jody's father, Gary Plauché. Anguished by his son's kidnapping and abuse, Gary discovered when Doucet would be arriving at the Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport and went to confront him. With a .38 revolver concealed in his boot, Gary waited at the airport. As TV cameras recorded the scene, Gary pulled the gun from his boot, turned to face Jeff Doucet, and shot him in the head at point-blank range. Doucet fell to the floor, bleeding from a wound close to his right ear. As Doucet collapsed, police officers, including one who was a close friend of Gary's, quickly surrounded him. Jeff Doucet, critically wounded, succumbed to his injuries the following day. Even though it was clearly a planned act of murder, Gary Plauché's case gained a lot of public sympathy. Many people viewed what he did as a desperate father's way of getting justice for his son. Plauché was first charged with second-degree murder, but later accepted a plea deal where he pleaded no contest to manslaughter. The court showed leniency, and Gary was sentenced to 7 years in prison, later suspended, 5 years of probation, and 300 hours of community service. Jeff's act is the stuff of nightmares, but this next serial killer is the devil himself. He is known as Dzian Brown. Decian Brown is a 23-year-old man facing severe charges for a horrific crime. He was accused of throwing a 3-year-old boy, Nilo, from a bridge into the Ohio River and fatally stabbing the boy's mother, who was also his girlfriend, before dumping her body into the river. According to police reports, the boy's mother, Nitisha, was stabbed multiple times on or around Dexter 5, and her body was found in a bag near the river. The crime shocked the community due to its brutality. In court, 3 experts testified about Brown's mental capacity. All of them noted that Brown denied any involvement in the murders. Judge Megan Shanahan, who was the judge in the case, initially refused to take the death penalty off the table for Brown. Even though he was said to have bipolar disorder, the judge decided that his mental illness didn't stop him from making rational decisions or understanding the consequences of what he did at the time of the crime. Brown's defense team argued that his mental disorder should make him ineligible for the death penalty under a 2021 state law meant to protect those with serious mental illnesses. But the judge ruled that Brown's condition didn't stop him from thinking clearly. A shocking moment in the courtroom occurred when Nilo's father, Tonio Hughes, confronted Brown during the proceedings, and this ensured Decian isn't the only child killer on our list. The next killers were so evil that it prompted a family member to try and attack them in court. They are Jasmine Gordon and Clifford Thomas. Jasmine Gordon and Clifford Thomas faced Wayne County Circuit Court in Michigan, where they were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. This followed the tragic death of 3-year-old Jamila Smith, Gordon's daughter, who died from severe physical abuse. In court, the medical examiner revealed just how horrific the situation was.
I had the opportunity to listen to the testimony of the medical examiner, who testified that this child had over 50 injuries, and they were at various stages of healing.
The prosecutor detailed the events from earlier when Gordon rushed Jamila to the hospital. At that time, the toddler was not breathing, and Gordon was unwilling to provide any explanation for the child's condition. During the trial, an emergency medical technician shared that she had tried multiple times to get a response from Gordon about the girl's condition, but got nothing back. Meanwhile, courtroom drama unfolded when Dwayne Smith, the child's father, was about to give his victim impact statement. He ended up encountering Thomas and, in a moment of raw emotion, attacked him. Next on our list is another killer who got into the list of most hated serial killers in history. His name was Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, often referred to as the Milwaukee Cannibal or Milwaukee Monster, was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. His horrific crimes, committed between 1978 and 1991, shocked the world due to their gruesome nature. Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His troubled childhood was defined by feelings of isolation and a growing fascination with death.
I started having these obsessive thoughts when I was about 15 and 16, and they got worse and worse.
This dark interest escalated into a terrifying reality as he began his killing spree at the age of 18. Dahmer's crimes involved the brutal murder of about 15 young men and boys, many of whom were lured to his apartment under the guise of friendship or with promises of money in exchange for photos. Once inside, Dahmer would drug his victims, then strangle them. The horror didn't stop there. Dahmer engaged in acts of necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism, often keeping body parts as macabre trophies. The sheer brutality of Dahmer's crimes went unnoticed for years, in part due to his outwardly unassuming demeanor. His capture came almost by accident in July 1991, when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and flagged down police. When officers entered Dahmer's apartment, they found photographs of dismembered bodies and remains in various stages of decomposition, leading to Dahmer's immediate arrest. During his trial, Dahmer pleaded guilty by reason of insanity, but the court rejected this defense, finding him legally sane. In 1992, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, amounting to 941 years behind bars. His victim's family were so mad at him, and even called him Satan at one point.
Whatever your name is, Satan, I'm mad. This is how you act.
He caused so much pain to his victims, and they wanted nothing but to see him punished.
Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey, I hate you, motherfucker! I hate you! Nothing's under control! Don't fuck with me, Jeffrey! I'll kill you, goddammit!
Dahmer's life in prison was short-lived. On November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. This next guy did the unthinkable, and the family of his victim wasn't ready to spare him. He was called Wesley Ira Perkey. With his hands strapped to a gurney and a light blue blanket covering his body, Wesley Ira Purkey was put to death at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, by lethal injection. Purkey had experienced repeated sexual abuse as a child. He was repeatedly molested by those who were in charge of taking care of him. At the young age of 18, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and depression. He had also been in and out of prison for burglary and armed robbery. Purkey raped, killed, and dismembered a teenage girl named Jennifer Long about 2 decades before his execution. After dismembering her, he started burning her body one by one and took the leftover remains and ashes from the fireplace to a septic pond. He confessed to the murder of Jennifer and also the murder of an 80-year-old woman named Mary Ruth Bales, whom he beat to death with a claw hammer. He was convicted and sentenced to death for the murders. Jennifer's family traveled from the Kansas City area to witness his execution. Understanding that the execution will not bring them any closure, Jennifer's father and stepmother still stated that it was important for them to be there to witness the execution of the man that took their daughter's life. Before his execution, Purkey expressed his regret for the pain and suffering he caused to Jennifer's family. Jennifer's family were satisfied, relieved, and excited to see their dream of 17 years finally come through.
You'd have to put me down in order for me to miss this. I've been dreaming for this for 17 years. Long wait, something to think about every day. Relive every day.
If you think family members of victims have never wished for the death of a female serial killer, then this next case will change your mind. Lisa Montgomery. Lisa Montgomery was the first woman in nearly 70 years to face the death penalty. Lisa was a victim of severe abuse as a child. She was a victim of incest, gang rape, and brain damage. According to her family members, she was routinely sexually and physically abused by her father and trafficked by her mother. Lisa was convicted for the murder of a pregnant woman, Boobie Jo Stinnett. Lisa did not just murder Boobie. She cut open her belly, took out her child, and tried to pass the child off as her own. Lisa came prepared to the crime scene. She had even studied C-sections on the internet.
This is not something of somebody that's, has a mental illness. This was not a spontaneous fit of anger or rage. This was meticulously planned out.
Many of her supporters, including her own sister, asked that her execution be stopped. Her lawyers argued that she was mentally ill and should not be executed. Notwithstanding the number of supporters Lisa had and her sister's appeal to Trump to stop her execution, the family and friends of Boobie, Lisa's victim, wanted to see Lisa dead.
I know for me and a lot of people in the community, we need closure, and closure for us is them proceeding with the death penalty. I think what she did to my friend Bobbie Jo is heinous and unacceptable and unforgivable.
In 2021, she died by lethal injection. This next serial killer was so evil that no one considered him human. He was Joseph Edward Duncan. Joseph Edward Duncan was a convicted serial killer and child molester. Duncan had a long history as a violent sexual predator. At the age of 15, his first sex crime was recorded when he raped a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. At the age of 16, he confessed to his therapist that he had raped 13 younger boys. Duncan committed several crimes. He was a thief, murderer, and kidnapper. He attacked a whole family, killing a mother, her fiancé, her oldest son, and then kidnapping 2 of the children. He took the kidnapped children to a location where he repeatedly raped and tortured them for 6 weeks. He eventually killed one of them. Shasta, who was the only survivor of the Groene family murders, told the story of all Duncan did to her family. His victim's family hated him and desperately wanted him to be executed. They described him as inhumane and wished him a fate worse than death.
Even think of Duncan as human.
Unfortunately, Duncan died a natural death before his federal death sentence was carried out, but it still would have brought a sort of relief to the family of the victims that he was eventually gone from this world. For this next guy, the victims' families really let out their anger and openly called for his head. He was Otis Toole. Unlike other serial killers, there have been controversies on whether he was actually a serial killer or was merely a compliant interviewee used to clear unsolved murders from the books. Toole grew up with an alcoholic father and abusive mother who dressed him up in girls' clothing. As a child, he was subjected to abuse and forced incest by several close relatives and acquaintances, including his older sister, his father's friend, and a neighbor. He claimed that his maternal grandmother, who was involved in satanic practices, exposed him to rituals such as grave robbing. At just Just 14 years old, Toole committed his first murder by running over a traveling salesman who had propositioned him for sex with his own car. He later confessed to multiple murders, including the killing of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, who was abducted from a department store at the Hollywood Mall in Hollywood, Florida. His severed head was later found in a carnal 2 weeks later. However, despite his confession, Toole was never convicted of the crime, as key evidence was reportedly lost, and he eventually recanted his statement. There were a lot of inconsistencies in Toole's confessions. It is believed that Toole made a number of false confessions. He kept playing mind games in the courtroom, repeatedly changing his story.
That's what it said on the news. I was playing mind games. Well, what kind of mind games you want to play with?
Toole was given 2 death sentences that were eventually changed to life imprisonment upon appeal. Mrs. Walsh, the mother of his victim, was bitter and angry at Toole for the death of her 6-year-old son. They clamored for Toole's execution for decades and must have breathed a sigh of relief when they heard he died of cirrhosis in prison. Ever heard of the DC Sniper? Well, here's the story about him and why almost everyone wanted him dead. John Allen Muhammad. John Allen Muhammad was a convicted American serial killer who, along with his teenage accomplice Lee Boyd Malvo, carried out a series of coordinated shootings that terrorized the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area in October 2002.
He was a demolition expert shot. He could make a weapon out of anything, and he was a hand-to-hand combat expert.
It earned John the name DC Sniper. The pair, using a modified blue Chevrolet Caprice as a mobile sniper's nest, randomly targeted civilians over a 3-week period, killing 10 people and critically injuring 3 others. Victims were shot at random while going about their daily lives, pumping gas, shopping, or simply walking down the street. The randomness of the shootings made the attacks even more terrifying, as no one knew when or where the next strike would occur.
They were everybody's brother, sister, mother, father. They were out just going about doing everyday things, and their lives were taken from them.
Muhammad, a Gulf War veteran, had a complex and troubled background, including a history of domestic violence, custody battles, and failed business ventures. His motivations included a desire to extort the government for millions of dollars and a personal vendetta against his ex-wife, whom he had hoped to kill in the spree to mask her death, among the other random killings. After a series of investigative breakthroughs, Muhammad and Malvo were apprehended on October 24, 2002, while sleeping in their car at a rest stop in Maryland. The public, along with many of the victims' families, strongly advocated for Muhammad's execution, believing it was necessary to deliver justice for the lives he took and to ensure the safety of others. He was executed by lethal injection on November 10, 2009. Adult serial killers are not the only ones hated by people. Here's a teenager whose crime was so evil that it made the family members openly confess their hatred for him. He is T.J. Lane. T.J. Lane is an American criminal who gained notoriety for the Chardon High School shooting in Ohio. On February 27, 2012, Lane, then 17 years old, opened fire in the school cafeteria, killing 3 students, Daniel Parmator, Demetrius Hewlin, and Russell King Jr., and injuring 3 others. Lane's motive for the attack remains unclear, though it was reported that he had a troubled upbringing and struggled with mental health issues. Despite these challenges, his actions shocked the nation, particularly due to the cold and calculated nature of the attack. During his trial, Lane showed a disturbing lack of remorse.
Saying pull the trigger to kill your son, based on memory.
He even wore a t-shirt with the word killer written across it to the courtroom and taunted the victims' families. Lane pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His victims' parents were sad and could never understand why he would do such a thing.
I hate you for the pain you have caused, Nick. You chased him down the hall and fired the last bullet that paralyzed him. You're lucky I have to read this because I'd be staring at you the whole time. Why? Why did you do it? Why?
They made sure he was never released from prison.
You will never, ever be in my thoughts after this. Never. My family will move on, not you.
The families of TJ's victims were ready to move on, but in this next case, the pain caused by this serial killer was so much that a family member lost it in court and did the unthinkable. Let's move into the case of Michael Madison. Michael Madison's name became a symbol of dread as his dark deeds came to light in early 2010s. Born on October 15, 1977, he was brought up in a world known to have problems, but it was his horrific crimes that would seal his wicked actions. Between 2012 and 2013, Madison brutally murdered 3 women, though authorities suspect his victim count could be higher. His crimes came to light in July 2013 when police discovered the decomposing bodies of 3 women, Sherelle Terry, Shatisha Sheely, and Angela Deskins, hidden in garbage bags near his apartment. The victims had been strangled, and their bodies showed signs of prolonged abuse. During his trial, Madison showed little remorse, smirking at the victims' families as they testified. The brutal nature of his crimes and his lack of remorse led the victims' families to advocate strongly for the death penalty during his trial. Their desire for justice and closure must have influenced the decision to sentence Madison to death in 2016. In fact, during his sentencing, a victim's father even attacked him in court. In 2016, Michael Madison was sentenced to death for his crimes. The sentencing provided some closure to the victims' families. Despite multiple appeals, his death sentence was upheld, and he is still on death row. Last on the list is a serial killer whose death was made possible by the victims' families. He was Timothy McVeigh. On April 19, 1995, Timothy McVeigh committed one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. McVeigh, a former soldier, was deeply angry with the U.S. government and decided to take a devastating action to make his point. He parked a truck filled with explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City and detonated it, unleashing a powerful blast that ripped through the structure. The explosion caused the building to collapse. The blast killed 168 people, including 19 children who were in a daycare center inside the building, and injured hundreds more, leaving Oklahoma City in mourning.
Deep down as to why someone would do something of this magnitude, it's unreal.
After the bombing, a wide investigation quickly identified McVeigh as the main suspect. The families of his victims were determined to see him brought to justice. Many of them felt that the death penalty was the only appropriate punishment for such a terrible crime. They believed that McVeigh's execution was necessary, not only as a form of justice for the lives he had destroyed, but also to ensure he could never harm anyone else. Their voices were loud and clear during the legal proceedings.
The death penalty. Out of necessity, to keep him from hurting anybody else.
He was arrested, tried, and eventually executed for his crimes. He died by lethal injection. If you found this video captivating, tap on any of the cards on your screen to explore more captivating contents.